Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is September 27th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be asking, is Russia trying to shore up not just its battlefield losses, but its losses in the information war? Let's get into it. So, as we can see from the map, things have gotten substantially worse for Russia, or better for Ukraine. So, first off, you can see that this entire line of contact we've discussed along this river has, in fact, been expanded by Ukrainian forces. First, outside of Kupiansk, you can see that beachhead, as we talked about, or in this case, bridgeheads rarely stay bridgeheads for long, and this is clearly being expanded out, being pushed harder and harder, giving more and more of the a protective bubble through which Ukraine can safely move supplies, troops, and material. And once a large enough amount of material is crossed, Russian forces are going to really struggle to contain this. As you can see, they are also struggling because there's also a bridgehead just, it looks like, maybe 3 kilometers to the north in Dovorichne. And you can see now that with these two bridgeheads, they've created a situation that's actually, a couple days ago, these two bridgeheads looked very isolated, right? You could see here, they're just small outcroppings, and they look like they are in quite a bit of individual danger, right? Sort of surrounded by enemies on all sides. But you can see now that they've pushed out those lines, now it's some of these Russian forces in Lyman Pershi that are actually surrounded on multiple sides by the enemy. And they're probably going to be forced to withdraw, allowing Ukrainian forces to link up and then create a single salient that controls two major bridge crossings across the Oxil River, one of the natural barriers that Russia basically needs to hold to keep its front line intact. And things are also getting worse down near Lyman. And as we've talked about, Lyman, it looks like the Ukrainians are trying to do a similar encirclement, force Russian forces to withdraw, and certainly they are well on their way. They've created this large salient here at Birohorivka and are now pushing out eastward from this Oxil Reservoir. And there's not a lot in the way of natural barriers that Russia can use to try to blunt Ukraine's drive until it gets to some of this wooded area here, all right? And that's going to be a significant problem. I suspect that when they cross this river, that will probably be Russia's call to begin to withdraw from this entire region. Of course, that's a significant loss of territory, certainly. And honestly, some of these forces here at Novoselivka are going to have a tough time. You can see there's not a lot of roadway that they can use to safely withdraw, right? They would have to come down here, go around this reservoir, and come out again. That's a long withdrawal when you have the enemy bearing down on you just a few kilometers away, really a few hundred meters in some cases. So again, we're seeing Russian lines continue to collapse. They're just collapsing at a slightly lower rate, but man, not by much. And this is really tough for Russia, who is, of course, going to be trying to contend that actually some of these regions are strong, independent countries in their own right. Obviously, they're not. And nothing reminds you more of how not an independent country you are, like having large portions of your sovereign territory held by Ukrainian forces. Of course, to every other country on the globe, this has always been Ukrainian territory from the start. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the way things are going at home for Russia. The answer is also badly. Institute for the Study of War is talking a lot about mobilization. They actually have a nice map that shows all the confirmed locations where there have been protests against mobilization. Basically, almost every single province. This is basically a map of Russian population density. Obviously, less populated areas, fewer recruitment centers, more populated areas. But you can see in some cases there's not just protests, but attacks against mobilization centers, attacks against administrative buildings. It's actually transitioning to being violence driven by protest. This is, again, in a country like Russia where the consequences for protesting can be very severe. This is really a telling map. But what I find fascinating is, just like we always talk about, one of the signs of desperation in an authoritarian regime is to create the illusion that the bad things that the citizens are witnessing is not, in fact, the responsibility of the leader, that the leader is moral, ethical, and has the population's best interests at heart, but is caused by a corrupt bureaucracy that's hiding it from him. And the Kremlin has, of course, apparently been taking notes from my channel. I'm kidding, of course. This is a playbook that's existed probably for several hundred years. Russia has actually been trying to blame the bureaucrats. And what's interesting is, of course, you can see there's been clear evidence that there's been wrongful mobilization of men older than the maximum age, those who've never served, those with medical conditions, and mobilized individuals are often treated poorly. So they've pivoted the blame to the bureaucracy itself, claiming that it's the enemy of patriotism, and blame the bureaucrats for focusing on meeting unstated quotas rather than correctly fulfilling President Vladimir Putin's partial mobilization order. One state television host threatened to punish workers of military recruitment centers. They failed to abide by the limited reservist mobilization order. Ooh, the Russian Tucker Carlson's going to come for me. But they are also amplifying stories where military recruitment centers released men who were deemed unfit for service, following involvement of local officials or with the help of Kremlin state media. And this is promoting this narrative that these errors are being corrected when called to the Kremlin's attention. This is really important to understand. This is a standard playbook of how these things happen. And it's not a secret, right? But it's hard to believe, right? Just like in America, we understand that bad legislative decisions, right? Bad decisions by federal entities, right, can often be blamed on some level on the leadership in charge, even if it comes down to, hey, whether they knew it or not, their unwillingness to correct it is evidence. And so the fact that you're seeing these weird one-off corrections says to me that these are actually, this isn't a feature, it's a bug. I'm sorry, this isn't a bug, it's a feature of how mobilization is supposed to go. And while they, are certainly touting the fact that the leadership doesn't know what's going on, it's ultimately reflects badly on the leadership, right? Either you don't actually have control of your government, in which case, how can you call yourself a leader? Or you do have control and you're running it really ineptly or corruptly or just straight lying. So they've decided to go with the least bad play, which, of course, is that the leadership doesn't actually know what's going on, doesn't actually exert control over the government, which in the short term probably will work out. Is a short-term solution, but in the long term, the damage to Putin and the regime's credibility is significant. Anyway, one other thing that I wanted to talk about that I thought was really interesting, and we're going to be turning, of course, to ground.news. Check the link in the description. Ground.news lets you see the way the same story is covered across the political spectrum. You get to see bias distribution, who owns these news sources, and I thought this was a really interesting story that Meta, that's Facebook's parent company, has actually identified and disabled a Russian propaganda network targeting Europe that actually pushing a pro-Kremlin view of the war, and supposedly that these were hundreds of fake social media accounts, dozens of sham news websites to amplify Kremlin talking points about the Ukraine invasion. what's interesting is not just that Meta, they're not as interested as they want you to believe in taking these sort of networks down. But I want you guys to understand that Russian propaganda, it's like not a joke. Like Russia, despite having very limited resources, is still putting a lot of resources into continuing information operations. So you should understand that even though Russia doesn't appear to have enough warm bodies to hold, literally even the smallest of villages in Ukraine, they are still putting a lot of effort into creating confusion in the information space. And that's one of their goals, is to just make it so that you don't really trust any accounts of anything. So just know, if you look in the comments and you see some stuff where you go, man, there's something going on here, it's possible. Just like when you cover news sources, when you read news, you should really consider carefully the news sources. Again, that's why I was like so amped to partner with Ground News, because I think they let us do exactly that. You can see AP, leans left, high factuality, independently owned media. Very, very easy to get a quick summary of who owns an outlet, what their partisan bias is, and how they cover a story. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. As you might have also noticed, speaking of censorship, YouTube, of course, cracking down on combat videos. So many of my most intense combat video breakdowns are actually going to be on the Patreon. I usually do a video every 2 weeks where I look at 5 or 6 different videos, give you guys a breakdown. Of course, thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons, you guys make this possible. And I will see you guys in the next one.